No, he didn't. Can you believe Greg just did that? Oh, I can't wait to keep reading with you today, fourth graders. My name is Mrs. Lawson, and let's go ahead and get this story going. We are starting chapter 9 of Lunch Money today. And our learning intention is we are learning how to use text evidence along with what we already know to make inferences about characters. We know we are successful when we can refer back to details about the character, use what we already know about the subject, and make an inference. So let's start with vocabulary. What is this word? Irrational, right? If you're being irrational, let's see what it sounds like. I know it's irrational. My reaction to that, it's only a liquid. And then this person's being kind of irrational when he's cutting that branch off because he's gonna fall, right? So what does it mean to be irrational? Yeah, you're not thinking clearly or reasonably. Good job, fourth graders. What about this word? Yeah, production. Ah, said Mr. Z, mass production, economies of scale, increased profit, and market dominance, right? So what does that mean, production? You got a picture of production over here. Yeah, it's the process of making an item out of different materials. One more vocabulary word. What is this word? Imitation. Good job. And right here we have this little kid imitating this bigger kid. Then Mr. Z said, what I was saying earlier, how you should be flattered that Mara tried to copy you. I wasn't kidding. Ever hear that old saying, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery? I think that Mara thinks you are interesting. So what does it mean to imitate somebody? Yeah, you're copying what they're doing. And there was another word that was kind of tricky there in that. Do you guys know what flattery means when it said that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery? Over here you've got some thumbs up. Flattery means to praise or compliment or give positive attention. So you should feel good when people are imitating you or copying you. So your foundational skill for today is vocabulary practice. You're going to match the word with the correct definition. So use two of these words that we worked with today to use them in a sentence. All right, chapter 9, apologies. Greg lay on his back completely still. Even with one nostril plugged, he picked up the oily scent left over from last night's dust mopping. He watched the second hand on the big wall clock and listened to Mr. D's deep breaths. His math teacher was also stretched out on the floor about 10 feet away. And Greg thought, now I'm completely sunk. This guy's gonna ruin me. And then another deeper voice said, yeah, and I deserve it. And Greg knew that second voice was telling the truth. He said, Mr. Z, in a voice so weak it was hard to hear, Mr. Z said, yes? I'm sorry about the blood stuff. After I saw it made you sick, Mara's right. It was mean, so I'm sorry. Mr. Z was quiet. Then he said, I know it's irrational, my reaction to that. It's only a liquid and only a word, but seeing it and hearing that word and thinking about it, it gets me every time. Greg thought a moment. He said, with me, it's snakes. And lying there on the floor, Greg shivered. I don't even like pictures of them. Mr. Z said, ah, yes, pictures. When I was in junior high, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. I went to the public library and found a medical textbook. It had pictures. That was the end of my medical career. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Irrational. Anyway, apology accepted. After a moment, Mr. Z said, what about the other matter? Losing your temper over the little books? Any apologies for that? Greg didn't say anything. Mr. Z said, earlier, when I told you I was delayed in the office, I was looking through your student file and Mara's. You two have quite a history of conflict, and I thought it was going to be the big problem. I thought I was going to be the big problem solver. I thought getting you to apologize would be a help for both of you. Greg turned his head to look at Mr. Z. Moving a little so the legs of the desks didn't block his view. The teacher had his eyes shut and his face still looked pale. But you don't understand, Greg said. About my comic books, I mean. I worked all summer. It's like this whole business I'm trying to start. It'll make tons of money. And at the start of math class, I was thinking Mara would mess it all up. What? You don't think that anymore? Asked Mr. Z. Not really, said Greg. I got a better look at her mini book. She's drawing all her pictures by hand, making her books one at a time. And you're not? No, said Greg. I make one original copy and then print the rest using a copier. Ah, said Mr. Z, mass production, economies of scale, increased profits, and market dominance, right? So market is the buying and selling of a specific item. So dominance would be he's dominating selling them, like he's the only one doing it. Greg only understood about half of that, but he said, right, I can make 40 or 50 copies in an hour, and the materials cost about 2 cents per copy. Then I sell each one for a quarter, and I've got about 20 more comics all planned out. Mr. Z opened his eyes and turned his head. Ooh, so how does the phrase market dominance inform you about Greg's conflict with Mara? So I kind of just talked about market is the selling of the item, and dominance means you're in charge. So why are Greg and Mara having this conflict over the mini books? Let's think about that. Let me go back. What do you guys think? Yeah, what I'm hearing you guys say is great. He wants to be in charge, and he's thinking if Mara comes in with these other books, he's not going to be in charge anymore. He's going to be fighting her for that control. So it says, Mr. Z opened his eyes and turned his head to look at Greg. You see that? Talking was good. Helped me understand. So why didn't you just talk to Mara? Greg shrugged. Because she's so annoying. Mr. Z's eyes drifted to the blood on Greg's shirt, and he quickly turned his eyes to the ceiling. He said, I've got a theory about why you two keep fighting. You're both very much alike, and you're each too stubborn to take a step towards being friends. Greg wasn't sure what to say to that, and while he was thinking, Mara came back into the room with the principal right behind her. Mrs. Davenport said, my goodness, looks like an emergency room in here. A bleeder and a fainter come face to face. What are the odds of that? If we can patch up the math teacher, he can run the numbers and figure that out, she chuckled. Mrs. Emmett's gone, so I'm your nurse, like it or not. She went to Greg's first and handed him a cold pack. Mara, tell me you already know what to do with this. Greg nodded. Oh, Mara tells me you already know what to do with this. Greg nodded and pressed the blue plastic bag against his nose. The principal gave a towel and a cold pack to Mr. Z. Then she pulled a desk closer and lifted his 2 feet onto the seat. Get the feet above the head. That's first aid for big, strong, swooning victims. Mrs. Davenport chuckled again. Mr. Z did not. Principal said, Greg, I've already called your mother and she'll meet you at home. Mara's mother is coming in about 5 minutes and she's driving you both. Then she turned to Mara and said, would you go to the girls' room across the hall for me? Wet paper towels. We've got to get Greg cleaned up so that Mr. Xenotopoulos can get up off the floor. Or we could just wait until it gets dark and all the BLOOD becomes invisible. She chuckled and then said, sorry about the jokes. I'm just relieved that this isn't more serious. Then turning back to Mr. Z, she said, and I know all the other teachers will also be relieved when I tell them all about it tomorrow. More chuckles. Greg had never heard Mrs. Davenport make a joke before, had not known such a thing was possible. And lying there on the floor, Greg thought, Mr. Z's going to get teased by the teachers tomorrow because blood makes him faint, and I'm going to get teased by the kids because I got a black eye from a girl. Mrs. Davenport used the wet paper towel to clean up Greg's face, and then the desk and floor. It was a big mess, and before she was done, Mara had to go back for more supplies. All right, Greg, up you get. Slowly, and keep your head steady. Mrs. Davenport helped Greg to his feet and then into a desk. Stay put while Mara waits for her mother out front. I've got to get back to the office. Mr. Xenotopoulos, will you be all right for another few minutes, or shall I call an ambulance? Greg could hear her chuckling as she walked away. He looked down at Mr. Z and said, does she always joke around like that with teachers? 'Cause she's not like that with kids. Mr. Z smiled weakly. It didn't seem proper to talk about Mrs. Davenport with a student, so he said, most teachers have a sense of humor, and that includes principals. Greg stared down at his blue and white soccer shirt, now streaked with blood. Greg thought red, white, and blue. Very patriotic. He moved the desk so Mr. Z would be able to see his front, and then he thought of a question. So, Mr. Z, do you wish sometimes that you could have been a doctor, like you said, or maybe some other job like that? I mean, instead of just being a teacher. Because if you'd been a doctor, you'd probably be really rich by now. Doctors make so much money. You know Ed McNamara? His dad's a doctor, and they're super rich. Mr. Z did not want to discuss his personal life. He just laughed a little and said, my older brother's a doctor, and he's not rich. Really? Greg was surprised. How come? Because he lives in a part of Idaho where they need a good doctor, but there wasn't a lot of money to pay for one. So on this page and the next page, we're going to look for what inference can we make about Greg. So let's look for some clues. Greg said, so how come your brother doesn't want to move to Chicago or Florida or someplace like that? Mr. Z shrugged. We haven't talked about it much, but I know he likes where he lives and he likes his work there. He's not rich, but he certainly has enough. And for him, enough is enough. Greg said, well, I guess that's okay for some people, but I want to be really, really rich. I'm going to make millions and millions. Said Mr. Z. And what's all that money going to be used for? He asked. Money? Greg looked at Mr. Z as if he was an alien. What's all the money for? To buy stuff, to go places and get whatever I want, and to do anything I want to. That's what the money's for. Mr. Z said, so, if you had all the money you wanted, what would you do? Greg shrugged. Anything I wanted to. I could do anything. Mr. Z nodded. Right, but give me an example. Okay, said Greg, like the house we live in now, my parents' house. It's not very big. 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a basement, playroom, a family room, just a regular house. So if I had enough money, I'd buy a house with something like 10 bedrooms and 15 bathrooms and 2 swimming pools and this huge entertainment center with a home theater and surround sound and bass boosters and a pool table and air hockey too. Stuff like that. Mr. Z raised his eyebrows. Interesting. It was the way Mr. Z said, interesting. Something in the tone and the timing. Greg felt a hint of disapproval from the math teacher, and that annoyed him. Greg said, so you're saying that teachers get paid enough and that you don't want more money, right? And you're saying that you don't want a bigger house with fun stuff all over the place and more bedrooms and bathrooms? Is that what you're saying? Mr. Z smiled. I'm not saying anything, but I will tell you something that I call the Xenophobe toilet theory. Most people can only use 1 bathroom at a time. So after they both laughed a little, the room was quiet for a minute or so. Then Mr. Z said, what I was saying earlier, how you should be flattered that Mara tried to copy you, I wasn't kidding. Ever hear the old saying, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery? I think that Mara thinks you are interesting. Greg made a face. No way. You know how teachers can tell which boys the 6th grade girls like? Greg shook his head and he wished Mr. Z would stop talking. He wanted to put his hands over his ears and sing Yankee Doodle. These were things he did not want to know. Mr. Z went on. Girls like the boys that they're always mad at or shoving or turning their heads away from or sticking their tongues out. Never fails. From down the hall, Mrs. Davenport called, Greg, Mrs. Shaw's here. Need any help? Greg called back, no, I'm okay. He jumped up and he wanted to leave before Mr. Z found something else embarrassing to say. Holding the tissue and the cold pack in one hand, Greg got his things together. Mr. Z said, could you leave me a copy of your comic book? I'd like to take a better look at it. Greg said, sure. It's still there on the desk with Mara's. You can have it, free. He hurried to the doorway, but then paused and turned back. Listen, Mr. Z, I'm really sorry about making a mess in your room, both times. And Mr. Z said, aha, a second apology. Also accepted. That's 2 for me, 1 more apology for Mara, and you'll be all caught up. Greg didn't smile. In his mind, he said, don't count on it. Out loud, he said, well, see you tomorrow. Yes, said Mr. Z, and if I'm still on the floor here when you come to class in 22 hours, then Mrs. Davenport should call an ambulance. As Greg headed for the front door, it was Mr. Z who was chuckling. All right, so now it's time to make that inference. So let's review. We know an inference is we got to take what the text says use what we already know, that schema, and make our inference. So let's go make this chart with me. Pause that video if you need some time, and we're going to go back and dig a little deeper in the text to see if we can make an inference. So once you pause this video, get this chart written down, and let's go dig into the text. So looking at these 2 pages, I'll give you guys a few seconds. What details about Greg stick out to you? What do we learn? Money? What's all that money for? To buy stuff, to go places and get whatever I want, and to do anything I want to. That's what the money's for. So he wants all the money. He wants to get a bigger house. He thinks that people should be paid more. So Greg wants to be rich so that he can buy lots of stuff. And Mr. Z kind of made him realize it's really more than he needs. Because Mr. Z was like, you can really only use 1 bathroom at a time. Why do you need so many? So let's dig in and think about our schema. What do we already know? Well, we know, I know some people who are kind of like that. They always want more. They're never satisfied with what they have. They're like, I want more, I want more, I want more. And Greg kind of seems like that. So the inference that I would make is that Greg believes that having more is always better. He's not satisfied with what he has. He always wants more, more, more. So that's an inference I just made based on the text and my schema. Good job, 4th graders. So for your reading response today, what do you learn about Greg and Mr. Z from this discussion that we just looked at in chapter 9? So dig deep, tell me a little bit about their character and how they're different, and I will see you guys next time. Bye, 4th graders.